My husband told his mistress, I am just his roommate with a ring, so I moved her in and moved his bank account out. I sat in the nursery I had painted with my own hands. I was 60 years old, and I had spent months decorating this room for a grandchild that never came. The air smelled like lavender and old dreams. I pulled up the nanny cam app on my phone. I had bought it to watch over a future that David had already stolen. On the screen, my husband of 30 years sat on our Italian leather sofa. A woman named Bella was draped over him like a cheap blanket. David laughed, a sound that used to make me feel safe but now made me feel sick. Don't worry about Brenda, David whispered, kissing her neck. She's just a roommate with a ring. I'm only staying until her father's trust fund clears. I looked at my gold wedding band, then at the documents on my desk. He didn't know the fund was in my name only. The game was on. David walked into the room 10 minutes later. He didn't look at me. He never looked at me anymore. He acted distant and annoyed, as if my very presence in our home was a burden. He saw me standing in the hallway near the nursery and scoffed. Why are you always hovering, Brenda? He asked. His voice was cold, like a winter wind. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I turned around and gave him a smile. It was a wide, terrifyingly bright smile that didn't reach my eyes. I wanted him to feel the chill in my heart. I heard you were feeling lonely, David, I said softly. I've been thinking about our lives. I think we need a big change. David paused, his hand on the bedroom door. He looked nervous for the first time in years. What kind of change? He asked, his eyes darting around. I just kept smiling. I didn't wait for him to answer. The next morning, I tracked her down. Her name was Bella. She was 23 years old and called herself a wellness coach. She was young enough to be my daughter, and she was incredibly naive. She truly believed David was a wealthy bachelor living with a difficult older cousin who refused to move out. I found her at her yoga studio. I watched her stretch and pose, thinking about how David had traded 30 years of my loyalty for this. I didn't walk in and slap her. That would be too simple. I waited until she was walking to her car. I approached her with a calm face and a professional tone. I didn't act like a jealous wife. I acted like a woman with a solution. How would you like to live in a mansion for free? I asked her. Her eyes lit up with greed. I went home and told David my plan. I told him I had hired a live-in holistic assistant to help me with my sudden anxiety. I told him I needed someone young and energetic around the house to keep me company. David tried to argue, but I reminded him that I paid the property taxes. 2 days later, the doorbell rang. When Bella walked through the front door with her pink suitcases, David nearly choked on his morning coffee. He turned pale, looking from her to me like a trapped animal. He couldn't say a word without exposing his own lies to one of us. Bella looked around the marble foyer and winked at him when I wasn't looking. I caught the reflection in the mirror and felt a surge of cold fire. David, meet Bella, I said. She'll be staying in the guest suite, right next to us. I made sure the ground rules were very clear from the start. Since Bella was my assistant, we had to spend a lot of time together. I insisted that we eat every single meal as a family. I forced David to sit across from his mistress while I sat at the head of the table. I treated David exactly like a roommate. I stopped calling him honey or sweetheart. Now, he was just Dave. I handed him a list of chores and a bill for his share of the groceries. Since we are just roommates with a ring, Dave, you can start doing your own laundry, I said over dinner. Bella looked confused. She started to realize that the difficult cousin was actually the one in charge of the house and the money. David's face was bright red as he scrubbed his own plate. If you want to see how I break them, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. I made sure David accidentally heard me talking to my lawyer in the study. I spoke loudly, making sure my voice carried through the vents. I mentioned the trust fund my father had left behind. It's worth $10 million, I whispered into the phone, knowing David was leaning against the door outside. But the bank won't release it until our 10th anniversary. I paused, letting the lie sink in. Wait, I mean our 30th anniversary. That is only 3 months away. I heard David gasp softly in the hallway. Suddenly, his attitude changed. He wasn't the cold, distant roommate anymore. He started bringing me flowers and trying to rub my shoulders. He was desperate to secure the bag. He thought he could play the part of the loving husband for 90 more days and then run away with my fortune. He had no idea that the fund was already empty and the paperwork was fake. Dinner that night was a complete battlefield. David tried to hold my hand over the pasta to look like a good husband for the sake of the trust fund. But under the table, I felt the air shift. I dropped my silk napkin on purpose and leaned down to pick it up. My heart turned to stone. David's foot was tucked firmly against Bella's leg, playing footsie while he smiled at me. They thought I was a blind old fool. I sat back up, my face calm but my blood boiling. I picked up my glass of expensive red wine. Oops, my hand slipped, I said. I tipped the glass perfectly, pouring the dark liquid right into David's lap. He jumped up, shouting in shock. "Just like your loyalty, Dave," I whispered. Bella stared at us, her mouth hanging open. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it might explode. The next morning, I began the real work. I went to the bank and started investing our joint savings. David had spent years letting me handle the finances because he was too lazy to learn. That was his biggest mistake. I opened a new business account in my mother's name. Every single day, I moved $5,000 out of our shared life. When David finally noticed a dip in the balance and asked about it, I had my answer ready. "I'm diversifying for our future, Dave," I told him with a sweet smile. "The trust fund requires us to show active investment portfolios." He nodded like a dog, too distracted by Bella's constant texting to actually check the statements. He was so blinded by greed and lust that he didn't realize I was bleeding him dry. Every dollar I moved was a brick in the wall of his future prison. I decided it was time to take Bella shopping. I drove her to the most expensive mall in the city. As we walked past the designer windows, I told her how generous David truly was. I sighed and leaned in close, acting like we were best friends. "He loves paying for things, Bella," I whispered. "He told me he's a secret millionaire. He's just waiting for the right moment to show it off." I encouraged her to look at the luxury items she had always dreamed of. "You should ask him for a new car," I suggested. "A girl like you shouldn't be driving that old sedan." I saw her eyes turn into bright dollar signs. She started touching the leather handbags and golden watches with a new kind of hunger. She believed every word. She thought she had found a golden ticket, but she was really holding a ticking bomb. The trap snapped shut a week later. Bella demanded a brand new Range Rover. She told David that if he really loved her, he would prove it with the keys. David panicked. He couldn't afford a car like that because I had already drained all the liquid cash from his accounts. He tried to make excuses, but Bella threatened to leave him. To keep his millionaire lie alive, David did something incredibly stupid. He went to a private lender and took out a high-interest predatory loan. He signed the papers with a shaking hand, thinking the trust fund would save him in 3 months. What he didn't know was that I was the one who secretly owned the lending company through a shell corporation. I was charging my own husband 40% interest. For more of this justice, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. That evening, I decided the roommate era needed a serious upgrade. I waited until David was in the kitchen, then I calmly swapped the locks on our master bedroom door. When he tried to enter that night, his key wouldn't turn. He pounded on the wood, looking confused and exhausted. I opened the door just a crack, peering out with a look of pure indifference. "Since we're just roommates, Dave, I figured you'd prefer the couch. Or perhaps Bella's room?" I said. I made sure to project my voice so it echoed through the hallway and reached the neighbors' thin walls. David stood there, trapped in his own web of lies. If he kicked Bella out, his ego would shatter. If he fought me, he feared losing the $10 million trust fund. He slunk away to the living room, clutching a single pillow. I locked the door and finally slept in peace, knowing his discomfort was just beginning. Within days, the house turned into a circus of greed. Bella took my advice to heart and started ordering wellness packages every single day. Boxes from high-end spas and organic juice companies piled up at the front door. Every single one was charged to David's primary credit cards. She even turned the guest suite into a personal spa, demanding expensive candles and silk robes. David was losing over $2,000 a week just to keep her quiet. He started looking haggard, the dark circles under his eyes growing deeper every morning. The upgrade he thought he wanted was becoming a financial noose around his neck. He would stare at the mounting bills with a shaking hand, then glance at me. I would just sip my tea and ask him if he had finished scrubbing the guest bathroom floors yet. The pressure was starting to show. I decided to turn the heat up even higher. I sat David down and showed him a fake tax bill from the state. I had used my old editing skills to make it look official, claiming we owed $50,000 in back taxes. "I'm so worried, Dave," I said, biting my lip for effect. "The lawyer says if this isn't paid immediately, the trust fund will be seized by the government." David turned ashen. He didn't have the cash, so he did exactly what I expected. He decided to sell his boat, his absolute prized possession that he spent every weekend cleaning. He listed it for a quick sale, desperate for the money. I had my brother's friend act as a proxy buyer. We bought that beautiful boat for only 20% of its actual value. David cried as he watched it being towed away, thinking he was saving his future. I was just taking back what was mine. One night, I accidentally left the baby monitor on in the kitchen while they were in the living room. I sat in the dark nursery, listening to the static until their voices came through clear and sharp. They were arguing. You said she was just a roommate. Why does she have all the power in this house? Bella screamed. Her voice was high and annoying. David's voice sounded broken, a ghost of the man he used to be. I just need to last until the anniversary, Bella. Just 3 more months and we are rich. Please, just shut up and wait. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. I leaned toward the monitor, my voice a ghostly whisper that I knew would vibrate through the speaker on their end. I can hear you, Dave, I said. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had heard in 30 years. The next morning, I told David the bank required a full audit. They need to see where every penny of our personal spending has gone before they release the $10 million, I explained. I told him I had hired a forensic accountant to make sure everything was perfect. In reality, the accountant was my younger brother, who hated David for years of neglect. David had to sit at the dining table for 6 hours, explaining every dinner receipt, every hotel stay, and every piece of jewelry he had bought for Bella. He had to account for every lie he had ever told with a paper trail. My brother looked at him with pure disgust, marking unauthorized on almost every line. David was sweating through his expensive shirt, realizing that his secret life was being laid bare in black ink. He was losing his mind, and I was just getting started. Bella was getting bored. David was no longer the fun, wealthy man she thought she had captured. He was stressed, gray-faced, and constantly complaining about money. I decided to give her a little nudge. I introduced her to my wealthy friend, Julian. In reality, Julian was a local theater actor I had hired for a few weeks of work. He showed up in a rented Ferrari, wearing a suit that cost more than David's car. He acted like a billionaire who was looking for a fresh, young soul to travel the world with. I watched from the balcony as Bella's eyes widened. She practically tripped over herself to give him her number. David watched from the window, his face twisting in a mix of jealousy and fear. He realized he was being replaced by his own assistant. The woman he betrayed me for was already looking for a bigger, shinier boat to jump onto. I decided to make a public statement. I sent out formal, gold-embossed invitations for our 30th anniversary and trust fund celebration. I didn't just invite our friends, I invited David's boss, his judgmental parents, and even a few people from the local press. I wanted a crowd. The invitations looked like royalty had sent them. David was terrified, but he felt he had to go along with it to keep the lie of the trust fund alive. He thought this party would be his big debut as a multimillionaire. He spent hours practicing his speech in the mirror. On the bottom of the invitation, I listed a very special guest in bold letters, Bella. I told David it was to show how inclusive our modern household had become. He looked like he wanted to vomit, but he just nodded and straightened his tie. He was walking straight into the trap. While David was busy picking out a tuxedo, I made my final move on the bank accounts. There was still about $200,000 left in our joint long-term savings. I sat at my computer with a steady hand and moved every single cent into an offshore account that only I could access. I watched the numbers drop until they hit the bottom. I left exactly 42 cents in the account. It was enough to keep the account open, but not enough to buy a cup of coffee. David was planning to use that money to buy an engagement ring for Bella. He wanted to seal the deal with her on the night of the party, right before he dumped me and took the trust fund. He had no idea that he was currently a pauper. He was living on credit and lies, and the bill was finally coming due. 2 days before the party, David went to the most expensive jewelry store in the city. He had picked out a 3-carat diamond ring for Bella, a trophy for his new life. He handed over his primary credit card with a smug look on his face. The clerk swiped it. Declined. The machine chirped. David frowned and handed over a second card. Declined, it said again. He tried 3 more, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. He stepped away to call me, screaming into the phone about a banking error. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. He had to leave the store empty-handed while the staff and other customers whispered and laughed behind their hands. He sat in his car and cried, the weight of his failing life finally crushing his chest. He was officially broke, and the world was starting to see the truth. David stormed into the house, his eyes wild. "Where is the money, Brenda?" he bellowed, throwing his keys at the wall. I was sitting in the living room in the dark, slowly sipping a cup of hot tea. The moonlight hit my face, making me look like a statue. "The roommate used it for rent, Dave," I said calmly. "Living in a mansion isn't free. I had to cover all of Bella's wellness bills and your predatory loan payments." He looked like he was going to explode. Just then, Bella walked in with her suitcases packed. She looked at David with pure disgust. She had found out through Julian that David wasn't a millionaire at all. She told him she was moving out to be with a real man who could actually provide for her. She didn't even look back as she walked out the door, leaving David with nothing but debt. David lunged for Bella's arm, begging her to stay. "I'm getting the 10 million in 2 days, Bella. Don't listen to her," he pleaded. His voice was high and pathetic, a sound that made my skin crawl. Bella didn't even pause. She just laughed in his face, a sharp, cruel sound that filled the foyer. "You're not a millionaire, Dave. You're just a pathetic guy who lives with his wife because he's too broke to leave," she sneered. She shook him off like he was a piece of trash. She left him standing there with the high-interest car debt and a heart that was finally as broken as mine had been. He watched her taillights fade, his shoulders slumping until he looked like a hollow shell. He turned back to me, his eyes wet. "At least I still have you, Brenda, and we still have the fund." I just sipped my tea in the shadows. The night before the big anniversary party, I cornered David in the study. I told him the bank needed one last final release document signed before the trust fund could be moved into his name. He was so desperate, so frantic to see those millions, that he didn't even ask for a lawyer. He grabbed the pen with a shaking hand. He didn't read a single word of the fine print. He just scrawled his name at the bottom of every page, thinking he was signing his way to freedom. In reality, the document was a full, notarized confession of his infidelity. It was a legal waiver of every single marital asset he had ever touched. He had just signed away his right to the house, the savings, and even his own retirement fund. He handed the papers back to me with a relieved smile. He thought he had won. The morning of the party arrived. The mansion looked stunning, draped in white roses and gold silk. The caterers were busy setting out silver trays of lobster and champagne. David was upstairs for hours, preening in front of the mirror in his best designer suit. He truly believed he was only hours away from $10 million. He walked downstairs with a smug grin, acting like the king of the castle again. I walked up to him and handed him a small, wrapped gift. "A little something to wear for the toast, Dave," I said sweetly. He opened it to find a silk tie. His face went pale as he recognized the pattern. It was the exact same tie he had left at Bella's apartment 3 months ago, the one I had retrieved while he was at work. He looked at me, fear flickering in his eyes. The guests began to arrive. The ballroom was packed with David's boss, his parents, and the local reporters I had promised a big scoop. David stood on the grand staircase, beaming at the crowd. He held up his glass, ready to play the part of the successful husband one last time. "I want to thank my wife, Brenda, for being such a dedicated and quiet partner all these years," he said, his voice full of fake emotion. He looked at me, expecting me to blush and nod. Instead, I stepped up to the microphone, my heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. The room went silent. "And I want to thank David for finally showing me exactly what a roommate looks like," I said. My voice was steady and cold. David's smile faltered, his glass trembling in his hand. The lights dimmed, and the giant projector screen behind me hummed to life. I didn't say another word. I just hit play. The nanny cam footage from the nursery filled the room, showing David and Bella on the sofa in high definition. The audio was crystal clear. "She's just a roommate with a ring," David's recorded voice echoed through the ballroom, sounding hollow and cruel. The gasps from the audience were like a physical wave. David's boss looked horrified. His parents turned away in pure shame. I reached into my bag and pulled out the trust fund papers, throwing them into the air like confetti. They were completely blank. "There's no $10 million, David," I shouted over the noise. "I made it all up to see how long you would stay for money you never earned." The room went dead silent as the blank papers drifted to the floor. David looked like a fish out of water, his mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. "I spent 30 years building this life, and you thought you could trade me for a trust fund that didn't even exist," I said into the microphone. David's boss, a man who valued family integrity above all else, stepped forward from the front row. His face was like stone. "David, don't bother coming in on Monday. You're fired," he said firmly. "We don't employ people with this level of character in our firm." David dropped his champagne glass, and it shattered against the marble. He looked around the room for a friend, but every person there was looking at him with pure disgust. He had lost his job, his reputation, and his fake fortune in less than 60 seconds. I didn't give him a moment to recover. I signaled to the 4 large men standing by the door. I had hired a professional security team using the very money I had moved out of our joint account. I handed David a single, small suitcase I had packed earlier. "Since you're just a roommate, Dave, your month-to-month lease is officially up. Your things are already on the porch," I said. David tried to argue, his face turning a sickly shade of white. "You can't do this. This is my house," he yelled. I simply held up the confession and the waiver he had signed the night before. "Not anymore," I whispered. The security team stepped in and grabbed him by the arms. They escorted him out of his own anniversary party in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. For more of this justice, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. David stood on the sidewalk as the gates of our mansion clicked shut. He realized the full scale of his ruin. The Range Rover was in his name, which meant the massive car debt was his alone. The predatory loan I had given him was also tied to his social security number. But the house, the boat, and every cent of our 30 years of savings were safely in my name or hidden in my mother's accounts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to check his balance. He had exactly 42 cents. He looked at the expensive suit he was wearing and realized it was the only thing he owned that wasn't touched by debt. He had no choice but to walk to the car he couldn't afford and prepare to sleep in the back seat. He was officially a bankrupt ghost. Bella didn't stay away for long. Once she found out that her wealthy actor was actually a guy named Steve who lived in a studio apartment, she tried to find David. She thought they could at least be poor together. She found him living in a parking lot behind a grocery store, trying to wash his face with a bottle of lukewarm water. She tried to crawl back to him, crying about how she had been tricked by me. But David was too broken to even care. He blamed her for everything. Their reunion didn't last 10 minutes before they were screaming at each other in the street. To make things worse, Bella found out that she was being sued for the promised car payments that David could no longer make. They were tied together by a mountain of debt and a burning hatred for one another. The final blow came in divorce court. I sat on one side of the room with the best lawyer in the state. David sat on the other side, representing himself because he couldn't afford a legal fee. I presented the video, the financial records of his spending on Bella, and the signed confession. The judge was an older woman who had seen men like David 1,000 times before. She didn't show him a single ounce of mercy. She looked at the evidence of marital waste and David's systematic lies. "Mr. Ross, you have acted with extreme bad faith," she declared, her gavel hitting the wood with a deafening thud. She awarded me the house, the boat, the remaining liquid assets, and even a portion of his future social security. I walked out of that courtroom a free, wealthy woman. David walked out with nothing but a plastic folder. I didn't let the guest suite stay empty for long. Since David loved the idea of roommates so much, I decided to give him some new ones. I rented out the entire wing where Bella had lived to a group of 5 rowdy college students. They were loud, they loved heavy bass music, and they threw parties every Tuesday night. David was currently forced to park his car on the public street right outside the mansion's gates because he had nowhere else to go. Every night, he had to sit in the dark and listen to the muffled sounds of laughter and music coming from the home he used to own. He tried to call the police to complain about the noise, but I made sure to stay ahead of him. I had already made a very generous donation to the local officers' charity fund. The police just waved at me and kept driving. The financial noose finally tightened around David's neck. I stopped making the courtesy payments on the predatory loan for the Range Rover. Since the loan was in his name, the missed payments hit his credit report like a sledgehammer. Within 2 months, his credit score dropped from a perfect 700 to a miserable 300. He couldn't even qualify for a basic credit card or a small personal loan. When he tried to rent a tiny studio apartment downtown, the landlord laughed at his application. "I've seen better scores on a high school quiz," the man told him. With no job and no credit, David was forced to do the one thing he feared most. He packed his single suitcase into the back seat of the car and drove 3 states away to move back into his elderly parents' cramped basement. David's father was a hard man who didn't tolerate failure or liars. He was humiliated by what David had done to me, and he made his son pay for it every single day. He forced David to work at the family's old-fashioned car wash for minimum wage. Every morning at 6 o'clock, David had to stand in the cold water and scrub the wheels of cars that were much nicer than anything he would ever own again. One sunny Saturday, I decided to take a little drive. I pulled up to the car wash in my brand new, cherry red convertible. I wore my most expensive sunglasses and a silk scarf. David frozen when he saw me, the soapy brush trembling in his hand. I looked at the rim of my tire and sighed. "You missed a spot, Dave," I said, tossing a nickel onto the pavement. I didn't forget about Bella, either. She was working at a low-end, dusty spa in a strip mall on the edge of town. She was miserable, smelling like cheap eucalyptus and cleaning up after difficult customers all day. I decided to expand my business portfolio. I bought the entire spa building and the business itself through a shell company. On Monday morning, I walked in as the new owner. Bella turned white when she saw me standing in the lobby. "I'm in need of a personal assistant again, Bella," I said with a cold grin. "For real this time." I made her spend her days organizing the paperwork for my actual trust fund, the one I had built myself through 30 years of smart saving and hard work. She had to document every dollar of the wealth she would never be allowed to touch. After a few months, the mansion felt too big and full of old, dusty memories. I decided it was time for a fresh start. I put the house on the market and sold it within a week for a massive profit. I didn't need the space or the ghosts of my past marriage. I moved into a sleek, high-tech condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the entire city. It was a place for a woman who was starting over on her own terms. On the day I moved out of the old house, I walked over to the mailbox one last time. I took David's gold wedding ring, the one he had left behind in his rush to flee, and I taped it to the inside of the empty mailbox. I wanted the new owners to see the trash he had left behind. I walked away without looking back. The final legal hammer fell a month later. I wasn't content with just taking the house and the savings. My lawyer filed a new suit against David for marital waste. We proved that every dollar he spent on Bella, the fancy dinners, the secret hotel rooms, and the expensive gifts, was stolen from our shared life. The court was ruthless. The judge ordered David to pay me back every cent, totaling over $150,000. Since David had no money and a minimum wage job at the car wash, the court ordered a permanent wage garnishment. For the next 20 years, a large chunk of his tiny paycheck would be sent directly to my bank account before he even saw it. He was officially working for me. Every car he scrubbed and every floor he mopped helped fund my new life of luxury and peace. To celebrate my new freedom, I hosted a freedom gala at my new penthouse. I invited everyone who had been at that disastrous anniversary party, including David's former boss and all our mutual friends. The champagne flowed, and the music was light and happy. I wore a stunning black dress that made me feel 30 years younger. It was the social event of the season, and everyone was talking about how well I had recovered. David actually tried to sneak in through the service elevator, wearing his old, tattered tuxedo and smelling like car wax. He wanted to beg me to drop the garnishment so he could afford a real bed. But my security team was ready. Before he could even step into the foyer, the guard blocked his path. "Sorry, Dave," the guard said with a smirk. "No roommates allowed." A few months later, the tabloids caught a photo of me at a high-end charity auction. I was seen laughing and sharing a toast with a real billionaire, a man who had built his own empire and valued loyalty above all else. He wasn't with me for a trust fund or a house. He treated me like a true partner, listening to my ideas and respecting my strength. We weren't rushing into anything, we were just enjoying each other's company. David saw the photo while sitting in his parents' basement, eating a 99-cent burger he had saved up for. He looked at my glowing face and his own gray reflection in the window. He realized that while he had tried to trade me for a younger model, I had actually traded up for a better life and a better man. One rainy afternoon, a thick envelope arrived at my door. It was a 10-page letter from David, written by hand on cheap notebook paper. It was filled with apologies, regrets, and claims that he had lost himself in a midlife crisis. He begged for a second chance, promising to be the husband I deserved if I would just take him back. I didn't even get past the first paragraph. I didn't need his excuses or his fake tears. I set up my phone on a tripod and started a live stream on Instagram. Over 50,000 people tuned in as I walked over to my industrial paper shredder. I fed his 10-page apology into the machine, watching as his desperate words were turned into tiny strips of useless confetti. "Some things are better left in the trash," I told the camera. The likes poured in. I stood on my balcony, looking out at the city lights. I felt lighter than I had in decades. David had thought that a gold ring and a shared roof made me nothing more than a convenient roommate he could exploit. He forgot that a wedding ring is a circle, and in life, everything eventually comes back around to where it started. He had tried to move me out of his heart to make room for greed, so I moved his entire existence out of my world. I wasn't a roommate. I was the architect of my own destiny. I looked at my bank balance one last time, seeing the steady deposits from his garnished wages. I smiled, knowing I had won every single round. I didn't just move his bank account out. I moved his shadow out of my soul. And that was the real wealth. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.